Jack the Ripper's story begins long before the murders, in the suffocating sprawl of Victorian London, where the East End lay forgotten beneath the triumph of empire, a place of overcrowded tenements, narrow alleys slick with refuse, and lives worn thin by hunger and exhaustion, where thousands existed one missed meal away from the street, and women in particular lived under the constant threat of poverty pushing them into dangerous nights. And in Whitechapel this reality was especially brutal. With cheap lodging houses packed wall to wall, gin shops glowing late into the evening, and the air heavy with smoke, sewage, and despair, a district so accustomed to violence and death that another body in the street rarely stirred attention, until the early hours of August 31st, 1888, when a woman named Marian Nichols was found lying on Bucks Row with her throat cut so deeply it nearly severed her head, her abdomen savagely opened. And something about the precision and cruelty of the wounds made hardened policemen pause, sensing instinctively that this was not an ordinary crime, that something new and deliberate had entered the streets, something patient and calculating. And as the days passed without answers, the city moved on uneasily, unaware that this killing was only the opening act of a terror that would soon grip London, consume the press, expose the failures of authority, and give birth to a name that would echo through history long after the fog had cleared and the streets had changed, because the man who would be called Jack the Ripper was already moving through the labyrinth of Whitechapel, watching, waiting, and preparing to strike again. And within days the second killing followed, confirming the dread that had begun to coil through the East End, when Annie Chapman was found dead in the backyard of a lodging house, her body mutilated with a brutality that seemed both frenzied and methodical, the wounds deeper, the damage more extensive, as if the killer were refining a process, learning how much time he had before discovery, how to work quickly and silently in near darkness. And this second murder shattered any remaining illusion that the first had been an isolated act, because now a pattern was emerging, a pattern bound not only by violence but by geography, timing, and victim type, forcing the police to acknowledge that they were facing a serial killer, a concept still poorly understood at the time. And they responded with increased patrols and hurried meetings, assigning plainclothes officers to walk the streets at night and questioning residents by the hundreds. Yet Whitechapel resisted order, its streets twisting and intersecting in ways that favored those who knew them intimately, offering doorways, alleys, and courtyards where man could vanish within seconds. And as fear intensified, the press amplified it, publishing graphic descriptions and speculative commentary that turned each murder into a spectacle, drawing crowds to crime scenes and turning ordinary citizens into amateur detectives, while the name Jack the Ripper began circulating after letters arrived claiming responsibility, taunting the police and mocking their efforts. Whether written by the killer or opportunists mattered little, because the name gave the terror a shape, something people could whisper, curse, and fear, and with that name the murders became personal, transforming a faceless threat into an imagined figure stalking the night. While rumors spread uncontrollably, accusing immigrants, particularly Jewish residents, medical students rumored to practice dissections, slaughterhouse workers familiar with knives, and even respectable gentlemen who seemed too calm or too curious, revealing how quickly fear could turn neighbor against neighbor. And despite the police interviewing thousands and compiling extensive lists of suspects, no solid evidence emerged. No eyewitness could provide a clear description. No weapon was found, and no motive could be proven, while the killer struck again in rapid succession, including the infamous night when two women were murdered within an hour of each other, demonstrating a chilling confidence that suggested he felt untouchable. And this escalation reached its horrific peak with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, killed indoors in a private room where the killer had time to unleash an unprecedented level of violence, a scene so extreme that even seasoned officers were shaken. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped, leaving behind a stunned city grasping for answers that never came, because no arrest followed, no confession surfaced, and the investigation slowly faded into cold files and unresolved questions, allowing speculation to take root and flourish over the years, transforming Jack the Ripper into a symbol larger than the man himself, a representation of society's darkest corners, of institutional failure, of violence against the powerless, and of the unsettling truth that some evils pass through history without ever being fully seen or named, haunting generations not because they are understood, but because they remain forever incomplete. And in the long silence that followed the final murder, London attempted to return to itself, yet the city was permanently altered, because the fear did not vanish with the absence of new bodies but lingered like a stain beneath the surface of daily life, and Whitechapel in particular became a place defined in the public imagination by blood and shadow rather than by the ordinary struggles of the people who lived there. While the police quietly closed ranks around an investigation that had yielded nothing decisive, their reports filled with crossed-out names, dead ends, and contradictions, and the files were eventually boxed away even as debates continued behind closed doors about missed opportunities, misjudged suspects, and the uncomfortable possibility that class prejudice and institutional inertia had allowed a killer to move freely through the streets. And as years passed, witnesses aged, memories blurred, and evidence decayed or disappeared, making certainty impossible. Yet the mystery refused to die, because writers, historians, and amateur investigators returned again and again to the same fragments, reinterpreting them through new lenses, proposing new suspects based on shifting cultural anxieties, each theory claiming to finally reveal the truth while inevitably leaving gaps that could not be bridged. And in this way Jack the Ripper evolved from a historical criminal into a mythic figure, detached from the specific nights and places of his crimes and transformed into a symbol of urban fear, anonymity, and the violence hidden within modern life. While the victims themselves were too often reduced to names in a list, their lives overshadowed by the spectacle of their deaths, even though each had a history shaped by poverty, resilience, and the harsh realities of their time, and remembering them forces a reckoning with the conditions that made them vulnerable in the first place. Because Jack the Ripper was not created in isolation but emerged from a society that tolerated extreme inequality and neglect, and that is perhaps why the story continues to resonate, because it is not just about an unknown killer but about what happens when human suffering is ignored until it becomes sensational, when systems fail the people they are meant to protect, and when mystery fills the void left by justice denied, leaving behind a shadow that stretches across generations, reminding us that some stories do not end with answers, only with echoes that fade slowly, never entirely gone, always waiting to be rediscovered and retold. And those echoes grew louder as the 20th century dawned, because the Ripper murders became a reference point for every subsequent discussion of violent crime, anonymity, and urban decay, cited by officials warning of moral decline, by journalists seeking dramatic comparison, and by criminologists attempting to understand the psychology of serial violence, a field that scarcely existed when the murders first occurred. And with each retelling, the boundary between documented fact and imaginative reconstruction softened further, allowing Jack the Ripper to be reinvented repeatedly in novels, plays, films, and lectures, sometimes portrayed as a monstrous sadist driven by compulsion, sometimes as a coldly rational predator, sometimes as a tragic or even romanticized figure, interpretations that said more about the era producing them than about the killer himself. While the historical Whitechapel continued to change, its streets renamed, its buildings demolished, its population reshaped by waves of immigration and redevelopment, yet beneath those changes the story clung stubbornly to the geography, as if the land itself remembered, and walking those streets invited reflection on how easily a place could absorb horror and then continue on. Because cities are indifferent in ways people are not, and perhaps that indifference was part of what allowed the killer to operate at all, blending into crowds that were already anonymous, disappearing among men whose lives were just as hard and just as unseen. And this anonymity fed the enduring unease of the case, the knowledge that the murderer was never revealed, never publicly unmasked, leaving open the unsettling possibility that he lived out his days unpunished, or that he died without consequence, taking his identity with him into the grave. And this lack of resolution frustrates the human need for narrative closure, the desire for beginnings, climaxes, and endings that make moral sense, which is why the story is told and retold, stretched and examined from every angle, as if repetition itself might conjure an answer, yet each examination only reinforces the same conclusion, that some crimes resist understanding, not because the clues are insufficient, but because history itself is fragmented, shaped by bias, loss, and silence, and so Jack the Ripper endures as an absence as much as a presence. A reminder that the past is not a complete record but a collection of surviving pieces, and that what is missing can be as powerful as what remains, leaving us with a story that has a beginning in blood and fear, an ending in uncertainty, and a long afterlife sustained by humanity's refusal to accept that some truths are simply never recovered. And in drawing the story to its end, the truth that remains is not the identity of the killer but the legacy he left behind, because Jack the Ripper ultimately stands as a convergence of circumstance rather than a solved mystery, a moment when social neglect, urban anonymity, institutional limitation, and human cruelty aligned to produce something that history could not neatly contain. And the failure to name him forces attention back to what is known and undeniable, that real people suffered and died in a city that had learned to look away from its poorest residents, that fear spread faster than understanding, that authority faltered under pressure, and that myth rushed in where certainty collapsed. And in this way the Ripper did not win immortality through genius or cleverness but through absence, through the unanswered questions that invited endless speculation, allowing him to outlive his own time and become a symbol rather than a man. While the streets of Whitechapel carried on, absorbing new lives, new struggles, and new histories, proving that places endure even when horror passes through them. And so the story closes not with revelation but with recognition, that Jack the Ripper was both a product and an exposure of his era, revealing the cost of inequality, the danger of indifference, and the way fear can transform violence into legend, leaving us with a narrative that has no single villain to point to and no simple lesson to extract, only the lingering understanding that some stories end not because they are resolved, but because time moves forward, carrying unanswered questions with it. And that is why Jack the Ripper remains, not as a solved case or a conquered evil, but as a shadow at the edge of history, fading yet never entirely gone, reminding us that the most unsettling mysteries are often those that refuse to end cleanly, slipping quietly into the past while continuing to stare back at us from the dark.